Apparently, everyone got mad at Kickstarter again. Red Ash, Keiji Inafune's spiritual successor to Mega Man Legends, failed to meet its Kickstarter funding goal when funds decreased after an announcement that the project would be published by a Chinese company called Fuse Entertainment. Fuse is making one of the first legal Chinese game consoles in a long time, and they have maybe the most hilarious English-language website in history for it. It's a really bizarre story, and I don't know how qualified I am to talk about it because I'm not a fan of Mega Man Legends. Even after the Kickstarter failed at the halfway point, even after playing an absurdly early prototype, and even after wading through the fine print of a second Kickstarter for the anime series and then a third campaign for an extension to the anime series, the one thing about this story that surprised me the most was the fact that they were banking on a spiritual successor to Mega Man Legends at all. And that might have been because the version I played as a kid was the Nintendo 64 port, creatively named Mega Man 64, which when stacked up against the PlayStation original didn't exactly score high points. A foggier draw distance, compressed vocal audio, missing features, and a more complicated control scheme dug the score far below the PlayStation original. But add to that the fact that Mega Man Legends is an artifact, a real artifact. There are older games you can play that won't feel older than this one, because this one is evocative of a very short period of like 2 or 3 years back in the mid-90s when games could actually get away with looking and playing like this. After the whopping 4 years between the original Japanese 1997 PlayStation release and the North American N64 version in 2001, reviewers were already calling this game laughably outdated. A 4-year-old game nowadays can still look pretty darn good, but in the years leading up to 2001, advancements in 3D gameplay were happening so fast that a 4-year-old game looked like something demonstrably and unknowably different from the latest standards. So back in 1997, without a cheaper delivery platform for cheaper 2D games, mainstream franchises had to go 3D or bust. A lot of franchises wouldn't make it, which would eventually include Mega Man itself. This game was being developed before everyone learned that they should pretty much be stealing all their ideas from Mario 64, which means that Mega Man debuted in 3D with a reboot/spin-off that featured all the awkward controls and camera work of other early 3D attempts, as well as an entirely new story continuity. There's no mention of Dr. Wily, no level select screen, no bosses that drop new abilities. Instead, we get to hear how excited this guy is about flying machines. So this is a spin-off where Mega Man is like Zelda, with ever-expanding over- and underworlds becoming unlocked as the player grabs new abilities, light RPG upgrades, and dialogue cues unlocked from progressing through dungeons below. And speaking of which, the dungeon music in this game is terrifying. How the hell does a game with music as bright and cheery as this one go straight down to here? Maybe they picked this sheet music up off the Resident Evil cutting room floor. I have a feeling a line of this guy's dialogue got left on the localization floor. What do you think? Yes or no? What might have also been picked up from scrapped notes of Resident Evil is the control scheme, which uses a different version of tank controls that are only slightly less stiff than RE Zombies. There are few degrees of gradation here. You have to rigidly rotate, then toggle 6 different directions of movement on and off, while being stuck to a camera that's locked to the same distance and direction from Mega Man's backside for the entire game. Clipping be damned. It's great. This is just great. Look at how great this is. You can shove this camera behind walls, into characters, into scenery. You can use it to scan upcoming sections of dungeons and see how the entire game world is just floating in a black void of nothingness. But what do you think? Yes or no? I got used to this eventually. It still failed me sometimes in the later games, but the journey there is just more evidence of how much of a relic this game is. What would be considered an unshippably incomplete camera system nowadays was an acceptable early attempt at 3D back then. They clearly didn't know what they were doing, but then again, there was no standard. Turning and moving is so slow that just picking up loot drops is a challenge in and of itself. Movement and orientation is no longer really a designed mechanical obstacle in modern games like it was back then, so it's fun to note how many enemies in the early game here, and how Mega Man himself, drop mines or bouncing bombs. They don't directly attack you so much as they drop hazards that you have to maneuver around because the developers knew that maneuvering was tough. But to offset the awkwardness, combat is generally very, very easy. Almost everything, from the first common enemies to the final bosses, just can't handle your sick circle-strafing game. It's too much for them. They can't keep up. Running circles around bad guys and firing in the general direction of the continent they live on almost always does the trick, but sometimes you actually have to aim. You have a pre-Ocarina of Time lock-on button that gets about half the job done. It sure does lock your aim onto stuff, but it also plants you firmly onto the ground and prevents any movement at all. To fight flying enemies, you have to turn yourself into a turret. You can't move horizontally while aiming vertically at the same time. Just another sign that the developers hadn't yet fully grasped this whole verticality thing, as well as what to do with the PlayStation's bigger controller. Your quick turn button is the same as your talk button. Your skip text button is the same as your cancel button. Meanwhile, the whole L2 shoulder button is completely unused, but that's just one of the smaller, cuter quirks of this game, compared to others that are subtle until you look for them, and then they become glaring and surreal. Like how the dungeons are barely 3D at all. Throughout my playthrough, I found only 2 floors that overlap each other, beyond the occasional catwalk or two. This is something that was a major limitation of earlier Doom-style raycasting engines, and it's surprising to see that the map designers here hadn't yet fleshed out ideas on how to design levels with multiple floors even after they had the technology. It's the bosses, instead, that seem to have had the brightest ideas put into them. Climbing on top of giant robots to hit their weak points, or climbing on top of buildings to fight giant robots that destroyed the city with persistent damage that remains for the rest of the game, are highlightable moments that show that the future of 3D gaming would have many more ideas in store than just circle strafing around enemies glued to the ground inside some flat, six-sided cube hallways, which is about half the game here. It's always a real shock coming out from these dungeons into the overworld. One side of this game features bright, vibrant, and convincingly mapped towns, and the other half is the Windows 95 maze. But what do you think? Yes or no? I think the characters here still hold up. Human beings are surprisingly the one aspect of these graphics that have stood the test of time. Going for a stylized, cartoony art direction was a brilliant way to offset all those 1997 limitations. As bad as these dungeons may look, the flat shading and expressive faces on the characters you see in between them paint a very lively picture. And what also helps is their voice acting, which so nicely hits that terrible 90s Japanese localization curve of being so bad that it's good. Everyone and everything is super cute and perfect in this world. It's a magical, wonderful place. The villains are non-threatening, bumbling comedy relief. The city's clean and peaceful, and everyone speaks in this high-pitched soprano voice that is almost patronizing baby talk. In a lot of ways, the hard edge of previous Mega Men was chiseled away for this reboot. It's something easier, friendlier, and probably for a much younger audience. Maybe one that wasn't tempered on the side-scrollers first. Besides the story being completely unrelated to the last games, you also see a dramatic shift with this spin-off from them being some of the tightest and most rigorous technical platformers around to being this slow, janky, piss-easy third-person shooter that doesn't fit the franchise at all. Hell, even the hard rock music references aren't there. Well, what is Rockman without the rock? At this point, Mega Man was 10 years old. The kids who grew up with the NES releases would have been teenagers by the time of Legends. And with the mainline series still going on at the time with high sequel numbers like 8, I have a sneaking suspicion that Legends wasn't exactly made for legacy fans, but rather a new generation of kids getting into this for the first time. Kids who are now old enough to be throwing around disposable money towards Kickstarters. Those are the fans who KJ Inafune was apparently relying on for Red Ash. The kind of fans who might get the reference that the Japanese name for the game was Rockman Dash, which seems like kind of a stretch. Mega Man Legends doesn't play like a timeless classic. In a lot of ways, it's been rendered obsolete, and it's kind of a divisive topic. I have no doubts that the sequel improved this stuff, but I'm still surprised that this was actually grounds for marketable nostalgia during the campaign. For however many writers there are praising this game, it seems like there's an equal amount bashing it, even back in the day when it was only a few years old. But now that I've completed it just this week after all the Kickstarter drama, it seems to me... it's okay. I didn't exactly hate it or love it. In fact, I enjoyed it a whole lot more this time than I did when I was a kid, and I think that's because now it has historical value that it did not back then. There were so many moments where I was like, wow, that's so wrong, and it is adorable. Because Mega Man Legends is an artifact. It's a fascinating look at the technical and artistic development of 3D gaming, and if you want to study any wonky early pre-Ocarina, pre-Metal Gear Solid, pre-Ape Escape attempts at fully polygonal 3D gameplay, you can do a whole lot worse. But that's just what I think. What do you think? That's apparently a yes or no question.